The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Welcome to Wellness Wednesday on W4CY Radio within the Entertainment Network. My name is Holly Kenley. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and host of Kenley's Keys for Recovery. Thank you for tuning in. It is so good to be with you. I often say wellness awaits each of us. We choose the time. By listening in today, you have chosen wellness. You see, I believe that most people want to be healthy in their lives, and yet sometimes they need a little help, and that's what this show is about. We are here to inform you and restore you. What do I mean by that? Each week we'll take a topic of recovery, such as grief or addiction or depression, or it might be a social issue or behavior that presents a challenge to our mental health or well-being, such as domestic violence, betrayal, bullying, or it could be both. And each week we're going to do two things. First, we're going to grab hold of keys to understanding what you are experiencing or going through. You see, I believe that when we have an understanding as to what is going on and why, that in and of itself is the first step in recovering. And secondly, we're going to get the keys to unlock your recovery. We're going to examine specific healing steps, tools, or strategies to become engaged in our recovery. And this is important. I believe that there are no quick fixes. Recovery is not a noun or an adjective. It is a verb. It takes time and it takes hard work. You'll often hear me use the word recovering with an ing on the end because it means action. Sayings and platitudes are wonderful only if we put them to work. Also, we're going to move one step at a time, one day at a time, sometimes even one breath at a time. We're not going to cover 15 topics in 15 minutes or 20 different things to change. Why? Because when we feel overwhelmed with too much information, we tend not to do any of it. Lastly, what makes this show special is that we're going to work hard at staying with topics and themes of each month. However, if something comes up in the news or you let me know about topics that interest you, we may dive into those. If it is not in my area of expertise, I will tell you and look for resources that can help you. I do want to mention that some topics may not be appropriate for minors, and I will let you know. Today on the show, we will be discussing domestic violence, peeling away the shame, the secrecy, and the stigma. And today is one of those shows where the topic is not suitable for minors. We'll be back in 60 seconds. Grab a piece of paper and a pencil. You may want to take some notes. Let's start today. Let's start now. Let's grab the keys and begin unlocking your recovering. This is Holly Kenley, licensed marriage family therapist and host of Kenley's Keys for Recovery. Today, we're going to take some time to talk about domestic violence. As I stated before the break, the information on today's show is for mature audiences. Domestic violence is one of the themes of awareness for this month. Sometimes, though, I feel like it's an issue that doesn't get the attention it deserves. Of course, October has other important causes, such as anti-bullying and breast cancer awareness. But I also think it's an issue that we're uncomfortable discussing. It often isn't until an individual loses her life because of it, or until a high-profile celebrity makes the headlines because of a domestic violent incident, that it captures our attention. I think, sadly, many of us can remember back to 2009 when the photos of pop icon Rihanna surfaced, and it did seem to shed some light on the issue, and it was a very difficult and disturbing case. Even though tragic stories capture our attention for a short period of time, I believe it is hard to look deeper into the topic of domestic violence because although we've made huge strides in its awareness, it is still shrouded in stigma, secrecy, and shame. Because this is an extremely complex topic with many considerations as far as protection, intervention, and prevention, for today we're going to examine a few basic keys to understanding what domestic violence is and just a few keys for intervention, a couple of healing concepts and considerations for victims. By doing so, I hope we can begin to peel away some of those layers of shame, stigma, and secrecy. At the end of the show, I will also give out additional websites for more information. I want to share that I have a special interest in domestic violence. Almost 20 years ago, as I was finishing my degree in psychology, I did a year-long internship at a battered women's center. And then over the years of practice, I honed my skills around areas of abuse and trauma. I also have a personal interest that I share in it with an experience that I'll share with you in just a little bit. In our conversation today, I do want to give credit for much of the information that I'm sharing to a pioneer in the area of domestic violence, Lenore Walker. Much of my training and knowledge is due to her work, and she is referenced in much of the literature. Okay, let's get started. Let's grab hold of the keys to understanding domestic violence. Let's first take a look at what it is. Domestic violence is a behavior, and we define it as a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power or control over another intimate partner. The key words there, again, are maintain power and control over another intimate partner. Although there are 5 different categories of domestic violence, most of us are familiar with the physical term, physical abuse. However, there are 4 others: sexual, emotional, economic, and psychological. A couple of side notes before we go into those 5 categories is that when I'm discussing this today, I'm going to use the female gender in reference to victims. However, it certainly can be a male partner as a victim as well. Also, any client examples I give, I have changed their names and altered their identities to protect confidentiality. And with all kinds or categories of domestic violence, they all carry with them the shame, the stigma, and the secrecy. Okay, let's take a look at the first kind, or the first category, physical abuse. This is the one that we most commonly think of because we see the consequences. We see the broken bones, the scars, the bruises, the cuts. And it's any kind of physical harm done to an individual. It can be hitting, slapping, shoving, grabbing, pinching, pulling hair. I even had a client say to me once, "Holly, is spitting on me physical abuse?" Yes, it is. Also, with this type of abuse, it can be denying the partner medical care for their injuries and also forcing alcohol or drug abuse upon him or her. The second kind of abuse is sexual abuse. This one is much more difficult to disclose. There is so much shame and embarrassment and confusion that surround it. Why? Because if it is someone who loves you, if it's a partner or a spouse who is abusing you, it feels so confusing and it feels so embarrassing. Also, many victims feel that it is her duty to perform or to agree to sex even if she doesn't want to. I remember that I had a client years ago. Her name was Samantha. I'll give her that name. And she was in her late 20s, and she was married to a man much older than she was. And she had to schedule her day around his needs. He would be out playing golf, and he would just show up, and she had to have sex with him. We call that sex on demand. And yet it was confusing to her because, again, she felt like it was her duty. So sexual abuse can be coercing or attempting to coerce a sexual contact or behavior without consent. Many times we've heard of issues of marital rape, which of course is sexual abuse, but it's also attacks on parts of the body, forcing sex after physical violence, and treating another one in a sexually demeaning manner. The third kind of abuse, domestic violence, is emotional abuse. This kind of abuse is also very confusing. There are a lot of mind games going on. Victims feel like they're going crazy. This is the one that I can relate to, emotional abuse, and also I'll talk about psychological abuse in a minute. In my early 20s, I was in a very emotionally and psychologically abusive relationship. I really didn't get it. I really didn't understand what's going on. I thought that I was to blame. I was always told I was stupid, ignorant, inadequate. I was always being put down, physically, emotionally, intellectually. I was constantly told I was ugly. And I believed it. And over time, I began to just really erode at my self-worth and self-esteem. I remember one time after he had been just belittling me and berating me for so long, I remember crying and saying, "Why do you want to be with me? There's nothing about me you even like." And it's interesting because years later, after I was out of that relationship and in a healthier place, I remember thinking, why on earth did I want to be with him? Part of it was I was so embarrassed and ashamed, and I kept it a secret. So emotional abuse is very damaging. It's when someone attacks an individual's self-worth or self-esteem. It can include things like criticism, diminishing one's abilities, name-calling, and it also includes damaging one's relationship with her children. Let's go on to the third kind of abuse, economic abuse. Oftentimes people don't think of this, but an individual or victim is held hostage to the financial reins or threats of the abuser. And oftentimes we think of individuals with little to no financial resources, and this is true. But I remember a client, I'll give her the name Samantha. She was extremely wealthy but she had no access to money. She didn't have any say in it and any means to get access to funds. Her husband controlled all the money. So even though there is money there, it's not being able to get access to it. In fact, when she would go out for lunch or something, she had to show her receipts, or she was given only a certain amount to spend. So an individual feels financially dependent by maintaining total control over the financial resources. Again, they can't access it. And also what's important here too is that many times the victims are not allowed to go to school or to get a job or to get employment. Let's move on to the last kind of abuse, which is psychological abuse, which I referenced just a moment ago. There are a couple key words here that are very important in psychological, and it connects to emotional abuse as well. And the key words are isolation and intimidation. And the goal of the abuser is to instill fear. This one is so important. First, it was my experience as a therapist that I often saw this as the starting point, just very subtle and hard to pinpoint in what is wrong with the relationship. Because the abuser, as I said, starts to isolate, separate them from friends, from family, and kind of restricting their routine and where they go and what they do. So it's just kind of hard. It happens very subtly and very slowly. Secondly, this is where the victim starts to think that something is wrong with her, kind of like she's going crazy and questioning her own sanity, because this is where the intimidation starts to come in, where the goal, again, is to instill fear and to threaten her, threaten friends or family members. I remember I was working with a young girl, a teen in high school, and I often did work with teens and saw this start to happen as they were dating. And she was fortunate in that her parents saw that the relationship was getting quite controlling and abusive and stepped in and intervened and set it up for her to meet with me. I'll call her Kim. And as Kim and I were working together, after we kind of got things stabilized, we went back and we looked at the pattern of the relationship to see how this unfolded. And this is where we bring in this isolation and intimidation. And she said, Holly, I remember that he tried to keep me away from my friends and family. He wanted to know where I was all the time. And there were constant texts, emails, and phone calls. And if I didn't get back to him right away, or if he couldn't get in touch with me, he got really upset. And Kim said, you know what, he always wanted to be together. And looking back, it was very just subtle at the beginning. And she said, in fact, I actually thought it was kind of romantic at first, how protective he was of me. And I thought it was kind of touching that he would be so concerned about where I was and what I was doing. So that's what I said. It can be kind of tricky and very subtle. And she said, but then it started to escalate into that intimidation. Little comments like he didn't like the way he wore her hair, or she'd wear a certain outfit. And here's the key, is that he started putting her down for it. He started making fun of her with it. And if she brought it up, he got angry. So again, we want to look back at this pattern of subtle behaviors, psychological abuse, where there's isolation and intimidation. And when the intimidation kicks in, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's not only threatening the victim, but perhaps her friends, her family, even pets and property. Along with these 5 different categories of domestic violence, there are a few other important characteristics. And it is part of the shame and the secrecy that surrounds it. We often victims think, that it is just happening to us. And no one is immune. I want to give you a few facts. Domestic violence can happen to anyone regardless of race, age, sexual orientation, religion, or gender. Domestic violence affects people of all socioeconomic backgrounds and education levels. Domestic violence occurs in both opposite sex and same-sex relationships, and it can happen to intimate partners who are married, living together, or, as I mentioned a moment ago, dating. I remember when I stepped into the women's shelter to begin my first week of work, I even had a bit of a stereotype about who was abused or victimized. And believe me, that was quickly dispelled. Let's move on to another important key in understanding domestic violence. What else contributes to the stigma and the secrecy and the shame? Within domestic violence, there is what we call a cycle of abuse. What do I mean by this, and why is it important? For a minute, I want you to think of a time where you were doing something over and over again for days, months, or even years. Something that you continually thought to yourself, you know what, this just isn't working. There must be an easier way, but you kept doing it the same way. It's what you knew, it's what you were familiar with, it was comfortable to you. And then, because of an insight, or you learned a new piece of information, or someone else suggested a new idea, you gained a better understanding and you had clarity, one of those aha moments, things made sense. And from that point forward, you were able to move forward more efficiently, more effectively, and in a healthier way. And even sometimes we look back and say, what took me so long? Why didn't I get that sooner? I know an example for me on a very simple level is every week in my technology, I kind of experience that. Well, I want you to take that same thinking, that same experience to a much more serious level as we discuss the cycle of abuse in domestic violence. You see, the cycle of abuse describes a pattern of behavior in domestic violence. It's an unhealthy way of being and interacting in a relationship. And it is a repetitive cycle of power and control that over time typically increases in severity and in consequence. In working with victims, this cycle is a critical piece in all aspects of treatment, in the protection, in the intervention, and prevention. And just as we talked about a few minutes ago, when victims learn about the cycle and understand what is going on, with that awareness, they can learn how to move forward in healthy ways. They can say, this is what is going on. Now I get it. Now I understand it. And it helps to break down that shame and that secrecy and that stigma. We're going to take a look at the cycle of abuse. It's in three phases. I'm going to keep them very simple, and they can be quite complex with other contributing factors. What I want you to do is think of a circle. Actually, I want you to think of a clock. And starting with the second hand up at the top, we're going to move clockwise. Okay, starting up at the top, as the clock starts to tick, the second hand starts to move clockwise. This first phase is called tension buildup. During this period of time, this is when the abuser has been functioning at his normal level, but then we see a little bit of inconsistency in his personality because there might be stressors, control issues, or a number of other factors, and I'm not justifying any of these, I'm just explaining them. There could be a drug issue, alcohol, psychiatric issues, or other underlying pathology, or past abuse. The abuser begins to feel and express anger and anxiety. Because he does not know how to deal with it in a healthy way, the anger escalates into rage. Innocent partners are blamed for the abuser's rage, and the victims begin to feel unsafe and unafraid. This is important. It is not about what the victim does or does not do. It is about the offender. It doesn't feel that way. I have had victim after victim tell me over time, Holly, I didn't do anything, and then he just got so angry. Or I just asked why, and he blew up. Or I tried to keep the children out of the way, and he just went off. Again, it's not about what the victim does or does not do. As the tension within the abuser continues to build, it leads to the second phase in the cycle of abuse, and that's called the battering incident. So if we're looking at our hand on the clock, and this can happen at any time, but just for our purposes, let's imagine the second hand is about the 20 after mark or the half hour mark. This is when the abuser is the most dangerous and out of control. You can't talk him out of it. You can't think him out of it. All of the anger and rage is directed toward their partner and possibly toward the children, who are frightened and extremely vulnerable. Now, typically we think this is when abusers attack their victims that are injurious physically, sexually, and verbally, and this is true. However, just as dangerous are the psychological, emotional, and financial threats and abuse. During this part of the cycle, the lives of the victims are at stake. I remember I had a woman come in to see me in her mid-40s. I'll give her the name of Katrina. She was a nurse, and she'd been living in a very, very violent relationship. When she was able to get away and come in to see me, the violence had escalated so severely. Her husband had pulled a gun on her many times, but this last time he actually put the gun in her mouth, and she felt that the next time it may be too late. Thinking back again to those photos that we saw of Rihanna back in 2009, when they surfaced, they illustrated the horrific damage that can and does take place during this part of the cycle. This is important. Too often, women return to their abuser because of this last phase of the cycle that I'm going to move into, called the honeymoon phase. If we're looking at our clock, bringing up the second hand, let's now move it to about a quarter to the hour or 20 to the hour. The honeymoon phase, or sometimes we call it the phase of contrition, this is a very, very confusing phase because soon after the battering incident, the abuser enters into this honeymoon phase. There are some feelings of regret or remorse over the battering incident, but Also, the abuser may know that there could be legal, financial, or professional consequences at stake, so he will say or do anything to make it up to the victim. This phase is also called the honeymoon phase because the abuser will promise or court his victim in a similar manner to a romantic stage. His aim is simple, to convince the victim that it is not his fault, it's hers, and he will never do it again. Oftentimes, victims do not reconcile with the abuser. If she doesn't, he will threaten or even give more extreme consequences. Typically, the phases within the cycle start to shorten in duration. This leads to more frequent and severe attacks and beatings. And a couple of other important points. Going back, thinking about when we get caught up in a repetitive cycle, doing it over and over again, it is crazy making. And remember, the victim feels that it is her fault. She is blamed. She thinks that next time things will be better, that she can do things differently. And she's extremely afraid and fearful and powerless to change it. Learning about and understanding the cycle abuse is a key to recovery, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Before we go to break, I want to give you one third key to understanding domestic violence. I'm asked this so many times, and so are other helping professionals. Holly, why do victims stay? Why don't they just leave? We are going to carry this question over into the second part of our discussion today, but I want you to take just a few minutes and think about the question as we go to break. I want you to maybe even grab a piece of paper and write down your answers to a question I'm going to give you. Here we go. I want you to think of any relationship, a friendship, a marriage, a partnership, etc., that you needed to leave or you needed to end, but you didn't. And I want you to write down a few reasons. Why did you stay? I want you to think of a job that you disliked but stayed. Why? I want you to think of a group, a club, an organization, a place of worship that you no longer wanted to be a part of, but you kept attending. Why? Think of a place you lived or visited that you really disliked, but you didn't leave or you didn't quit. Going back. Why? Think of any situation or circumstance where you stayed longer than you knew was healthy or good for you. And I want you to write down a couple of reasons why you stayed, why you didn't leave. We're going to take a second break. When we return, we'll talk about this important key to understanding domestic violence and how it will help individuals to move forward. You're listening to Kenley's Keys to Recovery. We'll be right back. Back. This is Holly Kenley, licensed marriage and family therapist and host of Kenley's Keys for Recovery. We are discussing domestic violence today. Please know that today's program is not for minors. We're discussing some sensitive material. Before the break, I asked you to think about a time when you stayed too long in a relationship, any relationship of any kind, and think about why you did so. I want you to know that I did this very exercise almost 20 years ago when I was doing my training to intern at the women's shelter. And I was blown away by the insights and understanding I gained into domestic violence. Let's think about some of the general reasons why we stay in unhealthy or undesirable relationships. And as we go over them, Think about this. These are the same reasons why victims stay or are afraid to leave. We all stay for financial reasons. We need the money. There's no way to support ourselves and no place to live or to go. We stay for professional reasons. We need the job. There's no other job available, and who would hire us? And we stay for personal reasons, out of loyalty, love for the person. We're ashamed, embarrassed, and we don't want to fail at the relationship. We might disappoint or let others down. Many times I had clients say to me, Holly, this is what I was taught. I was believed to just stick it out and stay with it. We stay for spiritual, religious, and cultural reasons. I had clients say to me, Holly, I can't go against my faith, or my friends and family will disown me. My place of worship will shun me. And this is the way I was brought up. I remember a client, I'll give her the name Erica, in her mid-40s. She's very, very strong and committed in her faith, and her husband was very powerful in her church. She was being abused horrifically, psychologically, physically, emotionally, and sexually. She felt that she was betraying her faith and felt her husband had the right to have control over her. She had to submit. She felt she was violating her spiritual beliefs and tenets, and she was going against her cultural norms. And another reason we stay is for emotional and psychological reasons. We feel weak. We feel we can't make it on our own. And sometimes we feel something is wrong with us. We have those thoughts coming into our head like, I just need to change and try harder. And that shame starts to creep up. And we believe things will get better. And we are afraid. And the list goes on and on. Why is this key of understanding so important, and how does it help us in our keys to recovery? As a therapist, when I was reminded how and why it is so difficult to leave, when I could connect with that, then I could move from a place of shared suffering. I could begin to really connect with that client's shame, embarrassment, and the silence. And I could move from a place of empathy for and empowerment of my clients. In other words, I could meet them in their place of pain. At the end of the show today, I'll share a brief story of a client where this proves how powerful this can be. For victims of domestic violence, and for those of you who are listening, this is a key to moving forward, to recovering, and connecting through this concept of shared suffering. Let me explain. When victims learn they are not alone, where we have all been in that situation where we stayed too long, where we should have left sooner, we all can connect with those feelings of powerlessness, of fear, and of hopelessness. And it begins to normalize those feelings of shame and secrecy and stigma. And it brings healing. And most importantly, clients will begin to share, or victims will begin to share and to open up. Something important to remember is that many domestic violence victims return to their offenders numerous times before they're eventually able to leave, seek help, and in some cases relocate or enter a shelter, etc. So think about this. Oftentimes they feel even more ashamed and more embarrassed when the violence continues or happens again. You know, I remember having a client or numerous clients say to me, even coming into therapy after we had established a safe relationship, Holly, I just couldn't do what we talked about. He said he was sorry and he was going to change. Are you disappointed in me? I feel so badly. So when helping to peel away those layers of shame and stigma and secrecy, let's remember the reasons why we stayed in the jobs, in the places, and in the relationships that we did longer than was healthy. And let's be present and available in a non-judgmental way. How can we do that? We can listen and we can believe. We can avoid blaming questions like, why don't you just leave or break up? We can avoid being critical of a partner or judgmental. What we can do is we can be a good listener, and we can be offered to go for help with them, perhaps in legal ways, financial ways, or even seeking shelter and support. As we continue, I do want to note that every case is so different. It's unique. Some cases are extremely dangerous, and there are important factors in play. And there are a myriad of tools and strategies in the protection, intervention, and prevention of domestic violence. And today we're looking at some recovering concepts in helping a victim to heal. We're just scratching the surface. Let's move into a second key in moving forward to recovering. This is the key of empowerment. Empowerment is the slow process of helping victims to reclaim their voice and their choice. I'd like you to know that all victims, whatever the kinds of abuse that it is, do not see that they have a choice or a voice in the matter. That has been taken away. Let's go back for a minute to that cycle of violence, where it's that crazy-making cycle going around and around, that control, that power, where we're not sure what is true or not is true. And of course, then we don't have any say in it. Let's go back to the kinds of domestic violence, where again, we have all those different categories that slowly erode our sense of self, our worth, and our esteem. We don't know who we are, let alone how to say it or voice it. So how do we begin the process of empowerment? It's very slow and it's very individual. And it's always a balancing act between the safety of the victim and of moving forward. Let's go back to that client that I was talking to you about a minute ago, Erica, who was very strong in her faith and whose husband was very powerful in the church. Reclaiming her voice was very, very difficult and slow process. Her ideas of submission were deeply embedded into her belief system. And it was a long process of moving from a place of submission to just an idea of self-respect and a concept of mutual respect. We did a lot of work in learning how to talk to herself, meaning to validate herself, affirm herself, because it was not safe for her to speak up. We did this through activities like journaling, meditating, in her praying time and her quiet time to herself. We began to empower her thoughts and entertain new ways of thinking and new ways of being. Also is the idea in empowerment of reclaiming your choice. And this one, again, can be very, very difficult. When I was working at the women's shelter, I did several different things there, but once a week I always worked the crisis lines. And many times, of course, I would pick up a phone call and there would be a battering incident and a victim would be on the other line of the call. And just the fact that she picked up the phone to make that call for help was one step in the process of empowerment. Many times I would have the opportunity to be able to counsel her over the phone. And that would be, again, a first choice and a first step. Other times, victims chose to come into the shelter. And I remember after we would oftentimes go get them at safe places and bring them in, I would be overwhelmed with emotion as I saw how a victim began to feel empowered, as she experienced the change in one choice, as she witnessed other victims reclaiming their choices and themselves, and as she saw that there was another way of being, and that there were more and more choices ahead of her. As the victim begins this slow process of empowerment, her voice and her choice return. A third key in moving forward to recovering, peeling away the layers of shame, secrecy, and stigma, is the process of reclaiming and reinstating oneself. This kind of goes to what I was talking about a minute ago in the empowerment phase or healing, but it's a little bit separate as well. Let me see if I can explain this. This is so important. It was my experience that many victims, and again, this holds true with lots of kinds of abuse and trauma, over time, that they see themselves only in relationship to their offender or abuser. They lose their sense of self, identity, and of individuality. The ability to move forward is relative to their ability to detach their value or lack of from the offender or the abuser. Now, this work is really difficult. It can be done whether a victim is still in the relationship, but certainly is easier if they've been able to leave the relationship. It's hard work, but it is such an important, safe tool and one that gives them hope and again, as I keep saying, a slow process. In my work at the shelter, I work not only in the counseling center and on the crisis lines, but I also had the privilege of working in a 2-year program called the transitional housing. What this was a place for women who had gone through a 30 to 90-day stay in the shelter, who then wanted to take the next step into independent living with their children. And this was just such a phenomenal program. They were, of course, away from their offenders and their abusers. And I worked there with these women in the 2-year program. In our weekly sessions together, what we encouraged them to do, and again, we did not tell them, but we encouraged them to date themselves for a year. Now, that oftentimes is a phrase that people chuckle at, but what we were trying to get them to do is to get to know themselves, have an opportunity for at least a year to grow themselves. And what we were asking them to do is to reclaim themselves and learn to restate their worth, their value, and their identity. What I noticed is that if women who went back into, not to their abusers, although some did leave and go back to their abusers, but women who started to date again right away, started repeating the same kinds of patterns, and again, really did not have that sense of identity, who they were and what they were about. So they just didn't take that time to do that detachment work. So again, this can be much easier work if you are away from the abuser or the offender. But still, today, with all of our resources, there are other ways to begin to work on yourself as well, through support groups that are in your area or online, and of course, keeping safety considerations in mind. There are wonderful books and websites and other online resources that you can access, and I'll give you a site at the end of the show. And through the processes like what Erica did with her journaling, her praying, her meditating, walking, and in that private quiet time that you have, that you can begin to reinstate and work on your worth and your self-esteem and your identity. Or of course, with a trusted counselor or therapist, again, keeping safety in mind. This third key, I know, is a process, as all keys are, and they take time, and it can be done. There are so many women that I had the privilege of watching rediscover who they were and who they were capable of becoming. I want to share a brief story with you before we get ready to close today. And I had so many amazing clients at the Women's Center where I worked, but this one is one that just kind of has always stayed with me so many years later, because remember, this was almost 20 years ago. I was interning at this women's shelter, and I do want to mention at the time it was just for women. Although I had many clients, this one I will never forget, and I'm going to give her the name of Hannah. She was horribly sexually abused as a child by a family member, and she had been in 2 horribly abusive relationships. When she came to see me, she was homeless with nothing to her name but this old bike. Hannah was in her mid-30s. She was tall. She was extremely thin, meek. She looked like a broken, fragile bird. At the counseling center, we worked on a sliding scale, and I did many cases pro bono. When I mentioned to Hannah that she did not have to pay, she wouldn't hear of it, and every week she faithfully paid her $2 for the hour. As a novice therapist who reported to a supervisor, I diligently developed this comprehensive treatment plan for Hannah, incorporating all these cognitive behavioral concepts and Rogerian concepts and strategies. And after I'd been seeing Hannah for a few weeks, I presented my work to my entire cohort under the watchful expertise of my supervisor. And by the way, we were required as interns to be in group supervision. With my elaborate genogram displayed across the large white erase board and accompanying treatment notes adorning the page, I felt confident I was on the right track. When I was done presenting, my calm, composed supervisor gently left her oversized chair, walked up to the board, picked up the large, dry, black erase pen, and wrote across my entire work in huge capital letters, "Build her up." Let me repeat those words again. Build her up! Exclamation point. And then, after she slowly returned to her seat, she turned and looked at me and asked, "Any questions, Holly?" I shook my head. Over the ensuing year, Hannah rode her rickety bike every week to the counseling center. See if I can get through this. Paid her $2 and allowed me the privilege of watching her find her being and grow herself. And although I served to gently guide and nurture her and redirect her course at times, mostly I had the honor of supporting and encouraging her as she empowered herself. In our last session, as she handed me her neatly folded $2, I was overwhelmed with emotion that the once broken little bird was ready to spread her wings and take flight. Today, we've taken a look at the difficult issue of domestic violence. We've peeled away some of the stigma, the shame, and the secrecy. By understanding what it is in all its forms and learning about just the craziness of that cycle of violence and why victims stay. And that's so important as we remind ourselves why we've stayed, why we haven't left sooner. We can have a better understanding as to the very complicated and complex journey that all victims face in their desire for wellness. If you are listening today and you're in an unhealthy, unsafe situation, please go to the website listed on my blog today, and I'm going to leave you with the number. It's the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. The number is kind of easy to remember. It's 1-800-799-SAFE. 1-800-799 and the word SAFE. And again, we'll have that on my blog when I post it as soon as the show is over today. However, if you know of someone who is in an abusive relationship, or you know of someone, be available and be present. Be a resource of support and a comfort. And as with so many critical social issues in our society, let's keep this conversation going about domestic violence. Not just today, not just in the month of October, but let's let our voices be heard whenever we can, however we can. If you would like more information, please go to my website at www.hollywithankenley.com. I will have more information, as I said, on my blog today, Wellness with Holly. Just click the word blog. As we get ready to close, I want you to remember that wellness awaits each of us. We choose the time. Sometimes it is harder for others, and I just want to encourage them and support them. Today may be your time. Grab the keys, unlock your recovery. Until next time, believe and be well.